Hey everybody, I'm going to be making this video that's reviewing and reacting towards Tucker Carlson and Putin's interview, but this is going to be focused more specifically on just China, and I'll be sharing my thoughts and things that come across my mind. I've seen this interview about twice now, and I think what people need to understand is that, you know, Putin works for Russia, and both of these people, Tucker and Putin, are very good at propaganda, and that everything you listen to regarding this whole interview should be taken for grain of salt and should be scrutinized as well. You want to do your own research and you want to back these things up with economic data or history or other resources as well to determine whether or not everything both of these people or even I'm saying is true. So I'm not an expert, not a financial advisor. Please do your own research. I'm just going to be sharing my personal ignorant point of views, okay? Um, so with that being said, let's get it started. So yeah, again, like it's very possible that yeah, do your own research.
And just as he had said.
Well, of course, it did come true, and you've mentioned this many times. I think it's a fair point, and many in America thought that relations between Russia and the United States would be fine with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, that the opposite happened. But you've never explained why you think that happened, except to say that the West fears a strong Russia, but we have a strong China the West does not seem very afraid of.
Okay, first of all, a lot of the foreign policy that I've been seeing, it's and even with I think it's the director of the CIA mentioned that China is actually one of our major threats, and it's the first priority threat. Why? It's not because China is militarily going to invade other countries like Russia or other parts of the world militarily or bomb other countries. Like, it's not that the United States fears China because of material military ambitions. It's more so because China has 1.4 billion people. This means that as they develop as a country economically and socially, they can compete in not only the realm of ideas, but in our exports like automobiles, high grade technologies, chips. And while this is true, China can also compete very competitively with our low end things like low quality goods and services as well. So China has a multi pronged approach just because of the way the demography is set up, where you have people in poverty coming out of poverty and develop, and a lot of our manufacturing is brought there too. So China exports both high quality goods and low end quality goods and textiles. So China is very competitive, and just because the sheer numbers and the resources that are available and the means of production being so developed, something that our manufacturing industry has lost, China is just going to be able to compete. So what the United States really fears about China is its economic potential, which I would argue nowadays with mutually assured destruction with nuclear weapons, most of the war, most of the war or the competitiveness is just in economics and trade. Okay.
What about Russia, do you think, convinced policymakers they had to take it down?
Запад боится сильного Китая больше, чем сильной России.
The West is afraid of strong China more than it fears a strong Russia, because Russia has 150 million people and China has 1.5 billion population, and its economy is growing by leaps and bounds, or 5% a year. It used to be even more. But that's enough for China. As Bismarck once put it, potentials are the most important. China's potential is enormous. It is the biggest economy in the world today.
I wonder, in the beginning of this interview as well, Putin mentions that Tucker Carlson could have worked for the CIA. But, just because someone doesn't work for the CIA doesn't mean that they don't actually work for the national interests of the American country, right? Like, despite Tucker Carlson coming to Russia and getting this interview, doesn't mean that Tucker Carlson doesn't work for the best interest of the American imperialist system, because he very well could, right? So an example would be like, it seems to me that after this interview, and based on just the knowledge that I have, that, you know, Putin and Xi Jinping before the Beijing Olympics had both discussed the unfair treatment of their equities and assets on the global stock market or equity market. So both countries and other developing countries don't like how equities are treated globally. Like, their equities are treated without like grade A types of insurance. They're not viewed in ways that are positive. And this is very apparent when you look at like the US versus China versus Russia versus other countries' equities in terms of like their PE ratios and things like that, where a company like Nvidia can have like revenues of 30 billion but have a market cap of around 1.6 trillion, I believe. It could also be the structure of how their economies are, where like the United States heavily relies on equity bubbles in order to prop up their retirement funds and things like that. But yeah, it's not good that these developing countries or other countries outside of the US have their equities priced undervalued, in my opinion, while the United States equities are just overvalued. They don't get that premium. And you can say what you want, like the economy's failing in China or Russia's economy's failing or anything, but the United States has a huge debt bubble, and these are things that people don't mention. The United States economy is failing too in a lot of ways that if you just go and have a discussion with people, they'll feel that way. So there's a cognitive dissonance when people discuss like China's economic collapse, where they'll say China's economy is collapsing because Evergrande, but they don't actually know the specifics. Like, um, could you quantify Evergrande's economic damage that was created by the Chinese government intentionally to pop this asset bubble? Also, do you know like the purpose of ghost cities, where you need to have like these cities prepared in order for the smooth transition of urbanization from poverty in rural areas, when you have all these people coming in? And with 1.4 billion people, is it possible that what could be a Lehman moment in America is more of like stepping on a huge thorn in China, where it sucks, it hurts, but it's not as nearly drastic? And then when we look at China's government cracking down on tech companies, a lot of the times it's because these tech or education companies and other companies are abusive towards its people. Like, so the Chinese government puts people's well-being over profits, while America puts profits over people's well-being. This is very apparent when you look at the gaming policies that China's cracking down on, where exploitative practices that encourage addiction and spending is being curtailed by the Chinese government. So that's also something really to consider, because if you really look at it, it's like, what's wrong with popping the asset bubble that is a real estate market in China? Like, this is something that the United States average Joe wants. What is wrong with regulating technology that can be exploitative and abusive? Like, your American companies are allowing this to happen, but the Chinese government is preventing it from affecting their people. I mean, yeah, you can find anecdotes where it's not, but overall, like, you have to understand that the Chinese government is putting its people over profits.
In terms of purchasing power parity and the size of the economy, it has already overtaken the United States quite a long time ago, and it is growing at a rapid clip. Let's not talk about who is afraid of whom, let's not reason in such terms. And let's get into the fact that after 1991, when Russia expected that it would be welcomed into the brotherly family of civilized nations, nothing like this happened. What are you?
Yeah, so in my opinion, I think most Americans, just from a micro level, from a ground floor perspective, most Americans, well, they just generally don't care about politics, and they don't even care because they don't even trust their own government, first off. And then secondly, most Americans do hate and have a hatred towards China and Asians and Chinese, because, you know, you can supposedly be against Russia and what they're doing, but there's a lot of hypocrisy too. Like, maybe you don't like, maybe the average American supposedly doesn't like how Russia is infringing on another state's sovereignty. But the United States is built on slave exploitation, infringing on other people's sovereignty, whether it be Native Americans or Hawaii, or installing authoritarian and dictatorships around the world in order to secure global hegemony, um, and the exploitation and imperialist system that the United States heavily relies on. And I think Americans inherently know this, so they don't fear Russia because Russia, unless there's mutually assured destruction and things like that, Russia cannot play a big role as China can when it comes to the real warfare, which is economics. But again, like, it's not really a warfare. You cannot, to me, it's like this. You have a United States imperialist system that exploits other countries, and it's sort of like a Ponzi scheme. And then you have another country like China and Japan in the 1980s and 1990s outcompete the United States. And then you have, like, and therefore, in response, the United States will promote anti-free and American protectionism type policies and sanctions and tariffs onto these competing countries like China. The problem is that it's easy to contain Japan economically because their population is so much smaller. But with China, their population is so big, their demography is so large, the geography is so large as well, that it's really hard to contain China. They can work around sanctions, they can work around trading partners, and as the global economy develops, then China can just work around trade and sanctions and just find other trading partners. So that is what the United States is scared about China. It's not that China is doing anything wrong or worse than the United States per se. It's that the United States doesn't like an economy stronger than theirs.
What are you doing? You are cutting yourself off. All experts say this. Ask any intelligent and thinking person in the United States what the dollar means for the US.
But
You're killing it with your own hands.
Right. So when you have sanctions and you prevent countries from trading with the dollars and using the SWIFT currencies, and when SWIFT ledger systems, basically you're encouraging other countries that use the United States dollars, which benefits the United States dollars, to diversify and move away from the dollar because they don't want to be sanctioned or abused. So the United States heavily uses its economic warfare as a means of pushing its own imperialist agendas. So when you have that, more countries are going to be aware that regardless if they do good things or bad things, as long as it doesn't work, it works against the United States. Even if they cure cancer, for example, if the United States oligarchies don't want you curing cancer and you're from a different country, then they're gonna put sanctions on you. They're not allowing you to trade their dollars. They're gonna push for all these economic warfares, types of antagonistic policies, which will ensure that other countries will diversify their economy, supply chains, and what they use to trade. So the more we trade of dollars globally, the more value dollars have. But when we don't use these dollars, the dollars return back to a country, which increases inflation. So you want dollars in circulation globally, but the America is weaponizing the dollar. Therefore, it's not a tenure that can be trusted anymore. It's losing that value. And like if there's 1.4 billion people in China and 300 million people in Russia and 1.4 billion in India or something, then you're kind of excluding like maybe 2 or 3/8 of the Earth population from wanting to actively trade in dollars, which is gonna, like, you can quantify that and determine like how much that's gonna add towards inflation if all these dollars end up going back to the United States and not circulate the global economy. Now, of course, you're gonna have to, that's just a figure of speech, right? You're gonna have to like really do the math on that. It's much more complex than that, but that's something to consider, right? So you want people using the dollar. You want people trusting the dollar.
I think that's a fact.
which is why like institutions and our government could be against things like Bitcoin as well, right? Whether Bitcoin is a Ponzi scheme or not, it's the concept behind it. It takes away from the dollar system, right? So it's the very same thing.
I think that's a fair assessment. The question is what comes next,
Конечно.
and maybe you trade one colonial power for another much less sentimental and forgiving colonial power. I mean,
First of all, China doesn't go around invading other countries. They don't go around bombing millions of people. They don't go around starting wars. They don't go around exploiting other countries at the levels that the United States does. Again, the United States is very much imperialistic, while China focuses on win-win cooperation. And it's always been this way for a long part of history.
is the BRICS, for example, in danger of being completely dominated by the Chinese economy in a way that's not good for their sovereignty? Do you worry about that?
There is no way that Tucker Carlson and the right in America can convince Russia to pivot from China and then work against China and help contain China. There's just no way that's going to happen.
Эти страшилки нам...
Well, we have heard those boogeyman stories before. It is a boogeyman story. We're neighbors with China. You cannot choose neighbors just as you cannot choose close relatives.
Right? You can't use Taiwan and you can't use Russia to fight a proxy war of China.
We share a border of 1,000 kilometers with them. This is number one. Second, we have a centuries-long history of coexistence. We're used to it. Third, China's foreign policy philosophy is not aggressive. Its idea is to always look for compromise, and we can see that. The next point is as follows. We are always told the same boogeyman story, and here it goes again. Through an euphemistic form, but it is still the same boogeyman story.
Right, this can be from like the Chinese Exclusion Act that we had in the past in the 1800s, or the Chinese Exclusion Act we see currently that is going on in America now. Everyone wants to hate this big bad China, and China isn't doing anything wrong inherently. They're just playing the capitalist game, and they're winning at the capitalist game as well. So, yep.
The cooperation with China keeps increasing. The pace at which China's cooperation with Europe is growing is higher and greater than that.
I think what people also need to understand is that they say that we are reshoring and diversifying from China. The thing is that we're not actually. What China can do and has been doing is that, look, a lot of the reason why, first of all, companies in America heavily rely on China in order to be profitable. Your Walmarts, your Targets, your Nvidias, your AMDs, your Teslas, like more than half their revenues for some of these companies come from China, whether it be through their supply chains, their manufacturing, or even their Chinese consumer base. You have 1.4 billion consumers in China and only 350 million in the United States. As their purchasing power rises in China, more countries are going to want the Chinese consumer base even more, because that's just more customers. Businesses are generally not discriminatory in this sense because money is money. You know, Starbucks heavily relies on China. McDonald's heavily relies on China. You know, most of the things you have, your iPhones, yes, Apple did reshore some of its, or diversify some of its labor force from China to India. However, this is not because Apple doesn't like in China or any kind of altruistic purposes that misguided whatever you think. This is because it's cheaper to have some of your manufacturing in India and then develop talent there because it's cheaper. It's their labor. As China's purchasing power rises, their wages rises, it becomes competitive, and you cannot bring all your supplies and all your resources manufactured from China to India because most of these countries don't have the means of production. They don't have the skilled labor. You cannot bring Apple to manufacturing to the United States because then your iPhones would cost $5,000, $6,000. While if you keep it in China, you can still have these prices of $1,000 or so. So that is the reason why you see these companies moving towards Vietnam or India and things like that. It's not because they're anti-China. They still are in China. They just want to have cheaper sources of manufacturing and cheaper sources of labor. So, yep.
That of the growth of Chinese-Russian cooperation. Ask Europeans, aren't they afraid? They might be, I don't know. But they are still trying to access China's market at all costs, especially now that they are facing economic problems. Chinese businesses are also exploring the European market. Do Chinese businesses have small presence in the United States? Yes, the political decisions are such that they are trying to limit their cooperation.
Right. So United States, a lot of its revenues and profitability for these companies, they rely on Chinese manufacturing and Chinese consumers. However, Chinese companies coming over to the US is at a much smaller rate due to sanctions and tariffs and things like that, and trade restrictions. So in order to bypass this, China can like outsource their manufacturing and factories to like Mexico or Vietnam or Thailand or Taiwan, which is a province of China. They can just have their manufacturing done there and export it to the United States. To bypass these tariffs and anti-free trade practices that America is pushing for. Um, so it's not really working in a globalized economy. It's just not. It's more rhetorical than anything else.
With China. It is to your own detriment, Mr. Tucker, that you are limiting cooperation with China. You are hurting yourself.
Also, there are some parts of the United States that benefit from anti-China policies, but that is generally those states that, well, first of all, like where they have some of the means of productions left, like energy production or manufacturing, like Texas or Florida. But this doesn't benefit places like California or Hawaii that rely on trade, that rely on technologies from the East. Here's an example. Okay, if the company Tesla relies on California government subsidies and state subsidies to develop and build itself up, well, and China too, it relies on Chinese government subsidies too, and 25 or more of its revenue comes from China. Anyway, I digress. If you have Tesla, for example, use up California state resident subsidies, build up its talent, and build up its homes, and build up its network and manufacturing in California, when it comes time to pay taxes, these companies like Tesla will avoid paying taxes, and then they'll have capital flight, and they'll move to a place like Texas. Okay, so that's good for Texas. However, when a company like Tesla does that, they generally take their tax dollars that could have been paid potentially, they take away the talent, and they create brain drain, and that just leaves a desert in a sense, where these once flourishing parts of California that relied on Tesla's manufacturing, they become barren wastelands, and then these people are prone to poverty because they lose their jobs essentially. So it's in these states' best interest to have foreign investments from China, like bring in their BYDs or their Neos or their Xpongs or their Hongqi companies. They want to bring these electric vehicle Chinese manufacturers because, one, if you do that, you rejuvenate your town with Chinese manufacturing. You start developing your talent again in order to build Chinese electric vehicles. You start increasing trade with and circulating your economy more with partnerships through Chinese businesses. So basically, where the United States companies like a Tesla used up California, took all its resources, and then left before actually being a return on investment for California, you have these Chinese companies that want to bypass anti-free trade practices by the United States and tariffs, bring their companies and businesses here, give jobs, bring foreign capital, and then give California state residents or Hawaii state residents jobs and the means of productions in Chinese manufacturing. And eventually that will provide talent, technology, skill, and money, which is what these states need. When you have capital flight and you have technological flight, and it creates brain drain and poverty, but this is something that no one really wants to admit, you know. So it is a shame, because that's the only way we're going to alleviate poverty. We need tax revenue. The government needs tax revenue in Hawaii and California. And if these businesses don't want to pay it, and they just want to use our countries up, or our states, you know, budget up, then we should have Chinese investments come in, because they can rejuvenate and bring in capital when these other U.S. companies do not, and they just avoid taxes.
It is a delicate matter, and there are no silver bullet solutions, just as it is with the dollar. So, before introducing any illegitimate sanctions, illegitimate in terms of the Charter of the United Nations, one should think very carefully. For decision makers, this appears to be a problem.
With the United Nations as well, we have to understand that these types of global entities, while they do offer checks and balances, and there is the P5, which is China, Russia, Japan, I believe, United Kingdom, and the United States, I believe, it's still dominated heavily by the United States and its immediate allies, which is United Kingdom and things like that. So, you know, these rules and laws are written at a global level by the United States, in a sense.
So you said a moment ago that the world would be a lot better if it weren't broken into competing alliances, if there was cooperation globally. One of the reasons you don't have that is because the current American administration is dead set against you. Do you think if there were a new administration after Joe Biden that you would be able to reestablish communication with the US government? Or does it not matter who the president is?
Сейчас скажу, но чтобы закончить предыдущий вопрос.
I will tell you, but let me finish the previous thought.
Tucker Carlson, you can't convince Russia to go against China. Like, clearly Tucker Carlson and a lot of Americans actually do fear China as its primary threat. And Tucker Carlson knows this too. So because of that, I don't know, does Tucker Carlson work for the CIA? You know, that's a very good question. Maybe. You know, when it comes to the left and right, they pretty much work for the same military-industrial complex and serving the interests of the United States government and the imperialist system and empire. So it doesn't really matter if there's a left and right, you know, at the end of the day. They both serve the same interests. The CIA is you can use that as a very vague term, right? So could he work with the same wants as a CIA operative? Probably. So does it really matter if Tucker Carlson is by definition a CIA? No, not really. But yeah, Tucker Carlson is maybe trying to see if he can convince Russia to work against China, which is just not going to work.
We, together with my colleague and friend, President Xi Jinping, set a goal to reach $200 billion of mutual trade with China this year. We have exceeded this level. According to our figures, our bilateral trade with China totals already $230 billion, and the Chinese statistics says it is $240 billion. One more important thing, our trade is well balanced, mutually complementary in high-tech, energy, scientific research and development. It is very balanced. As for BRICS, where Russia took over the presidency this year, the BRICS countries are, by and large, developing very rapidly. Look, if memory serves me right, back in 1992, the share of the G7 countries in the world economy amounted to 47%, whereas in 2022 it was down to, I think, a little over 30%. The BRICS countries accounted for only 16% in 1992, but now their share is greater than that of the G7. It has nothing to do with the events in Ukraine. This is due to the trends of global development and world economy, as I mentioned just now. And this is inevitable. This will keep happening.
Yeah, so this is just a byproduct of a globalized economy and countries developing. As we move towards the global development, this is just a byproduct of that. It's not good or bad. You cannot change the way that the world is moving towards. It's impossible unless you bomb things. But while the United States has always tried to contain its competitors ever since World War II, while it is in the interest of the United States imperialist and empire system to prevent growth from other countries and have this exploitative relationship between every other country, it no longer can really do that. This is just a byproduct of development. So imagine if there's a big war, and after this, America is a person, and it's the kid on the block, and you have a playground. The United States is like on top of the playground, and like he's like an adult. Well, everyone else is kids. China, Russia, Japan, India, etc. They're all little kids. Well, eventually, as they grow and develop, they all become adults too, and America can no longer bully them as much because, well, they're all adults now, and they're both all strong. So it's kind of like that in a sense.
It is like the rise of the sun. You cannot prevent the sun from rising. You have to adapt to it. How do the United States adapt? With the help of force, sanctions, pressure, bombings, and use of armed forces. This is about self-conceit. Your political establishment does not understand that the world is changing under objective circumstances. And in order to preserve your level, even if someone aspires, to the level of dominance, you have to make the right decisions in a competent and timely manner. Such brutal actions, including with regard to Russia and, say, other countries, are counterproductive. This is an obvious fact. It has already become evident. You just asked me if another leader comes and changes something. It is not about the leader. It is not about the personality of a particular person. I had a very good relation, and perhaps something may change. Look, China's economy has become the first economy in the world in purchasing power parity. In terms of volume, it overtook the US a long time ago. The USA comes second, then India, 1.5 billion people, and then Japan, with Russia in the fifth place. Russia was the first economy in Europe last year, despite all the sanctions and restrictions. Is it normal from your point?
To me, it's funny because a lot of the views and the xenophobia and the hate we have towards China, a lot of our disputes with China are very similar things we had with Japan. Even post-World War II, right? So in the 80s and 90s, China started exporting chips and vehicles that really and other high technological goods that competed with the United States. We had a lot of these kind of tariffs and anti-free trade practices directed at Japan. And you can look at a Trump interview where basically everything he said about China nowadays is exactly what he said towards Japan back in the day, which is back in the 80s and 90s. I think it was on the Oprah show or something. So yeah, to me it's very interesting. It all seems cyclical, like history repeats itself. So based on that, I don't think anything is really going to happen to the extremes that speculators think, especially war hawks.
Point of view, sanctions, restrictions, impossibility of payments in dollars, being cut off from SWIFT services, sanctions against our ships carrying oil, sanctions against airplanes, sanctions in everything, everywhere. The largest number of sanctions in the world which are applied against Russia. And we have become Europe's first economy during this time. They convinced the political.
Yep, so in a globalized economy, countries can work around and build alliances and have like bilateral trade agreements and just work around these sanctions. It shows that the United States is not in a position of power that it once had. It cannot abuse its position economically as a superpower that it once could because everyone has alternatives now, which is good in my opinion, and bad, but good too, because the United States doesn't always work in good faith for humanity. They do sometimes, and sometimes they don't.
Political leadership that it is necessary to continue chiseling Russia, to try to break it up, to create on this territory several quasi-state entities, and to subdue them in a divided form, to use their combined potential for the future struggle with China. This is a mistake, including the excessive potential of those who worked for the confrontation with the Soviet Union. It is necessary to get rid of this. There should be new, fresh forces, people who look into the future and understand what is happening.
Right, so you can't use Russia as a proxy war to fight China. You can't use Taiwan. It's very similar in this sense. And I don't know if Tucker Carlson, who probably was trying to, pivot Russia against China, or put Russia against China, if the United States were willing to compromise with Russia, that's just not going to happen. It's too late, and it's not going to happen. They cannot afford that. What are you going to do? Fight China by using Russian lives, by using Taiwanese or Han Chinese lives in Taiwan to fight war? There's this funny saying, we'll fight China and use and sacrifice as many Taiwanese lives as possible. Well, so it's like, yeah, I think if there was a hope in America that you can get Russia to work against China, it's just not going to work.
In the world. Look at how Indonesia is developing. 600 million people. Where can we get away from that? Nowhere. We just have to assume that Indonesia will enter, it is already in, the club of the world's leading economies, no matter who likes it or dislikes it. Yes, we understand and are aware that in the United States, despite all the economic problems, the situation is still normal, with the economy growing decently. The GDP is growing by 2.5%, if I'm not mistaken. But if we want to ensure the future, then we need to change our approach to what is changing. As I already said, the world would nevertheless change, regardless of how the developments in Ukraine end. The world is changing. In the United States themselves, experts are writing that the United States are nonetheless gradually changing their position in the world. It is your experts who write that. I just read them. The only question is how this would happen, painfully and quickly, or gently and gradually. And this is written by people who are not anti-American. They simply follow global development trends. That's it.
Yeah, so overall I thought it was a really good interview. You must scrutinize and you must question everything said today because, well, you have to check if the actual data from numerous sources are true. So when you fact check these people, just be mindful that the United States and its citizens are heavily prone to propaganda. If you think that China's bad, if you think that all 1.4 billion and its people are bad, but your country is somehow good or somehow bad, but not as bad, you're making exceptions, which is probably by personal biases and propaganda. So yeah, be sure to do your own research. I don't hate our country, but as an American, I am mindful, especially because of the place where I'm born and raised. It gives me the opportunity to be very critical on our country. There's a lot of people in our country who will just believe anything our politicians and media says. So I think whether you agree with Putin or not, or even your own government or president, it's good to at least be mindful of different perspectives and then come to your own conclusion based on your own research. Use it responsibly, okay? With that being said, I hope you'll have a great day. This was, I generally agree with a lot of the things said here, but this isn't just something Putin says. This is a general train of thought if you are mindful of the pros and cons of just global economic development. So with that being said, hope you all have a great day. Thank you very much.